Welcome all to the third sort of unit for this class concerning applied anthropology and also starting to get into what is an anthropological intervention also. So this part of the semester is going to be a little different than what we have done so far. The writing requirements for papers is going to lessen a bit in terms of your reflection papers. However, offsetting that is going to be you writing an intervention paper and also a reflection paper later on in the semester. However, as you see on the syllabus, we are rapidly approaching the end of the semester, so just make sure you're keeping up with assignments and due dates. Of note, the third quiz for this class is rapidly approaching. At basically the next 2 weeks, at the end of that, you will have your third quiz. And there's not a lot of material really to cover, so that means that it's very important that you have a good understanding of the specific readings, lectures, what have you, up until that point as well. So just keep that in mind, and I hope you enjoy applied anthropology. That is the primary focus of USF. We are an applied anthropology program, one of the few ones actually in the nation, and some say the first as well. Hello class, I hope you are doing well. I just want to point out that there are resources available to you right now if you feel like you need them. Whether that's counseling services or food assistance right now, just be sure to familiarize yourself with the resources you have available, because we aren't necessarily sure how long this context is going to play. It changes every day, as I'm sure you all are seeing on social media and the news, for instance. That being said, as an infectious disease scholar, I'm seeing the same things that I see whenever there's a new infectious disease, and that largely is the dissemination of, let's just say, inaccurate information that I think needs to be addressed. So as members of your communities, whether that's social media on Facebook or Instagram, I would encourage you all to encourage others to get their information from reputable sources, including the CDC and WHO, for instance. This is a tough time for all of us, and I'm sure there's going to be situations where it's just a lot of mental strain to get through, whether that's because you feel like you're cooped in the house or everyone moving to online is overwhelming for you. If you have any issues, please feel free to reach out to me or another resource on Canvas or otherwise, because we're all sort of in this together right now. On that note, please make sure that you're practicing social distancing. Even if you are a healthy young adult, you can transmit this disease to someone with a weakened immune system, including the elderly. As a helpful analog, I think, remember when we talked about Zika last week, I said a lot of people that aren't trying to get pregnant don't care about Zika, but they don't largely think about the possibility of transmitting it to a vulnerable person. So for instance, a pregnant woman who can get the disease and transfer microcephaly or another birth complication to the fetus through vertical transmission. Similarly to this, so for instance, if you are a healthy young adult going to the grocery store, for instance, and let's say you are an asymptomatic carrier, meaning you don't know if you have COVID-19 right now, you can still give it to someone with a weakened immune system. So for instance, an elderly individual going to the grocery store. So this is why it's important for us to, as you've probably heard in social media, flatten the curve. Basically, we need to practice social distancing in order for us to limit the possibility of this disease from spreading further. It's a numbers game. We're not going to wipe out COVID overnight. This disease is probably going to be something of concern, just like it is for Ebola or dengue or Zika for some time. But we can help limit the amount of overall cases and promote herd immunity in the process as well. That being said, this is again a rapidly developing context. Information changes daily. even hourly in some cases. So just make sure that you keep informed and that you're utilizing reputable information throughout this very interesting context. I'm not a doctor, I'm an anthropologist, but if you have any questions concerning what is a reputable source, feel free to reach out to me, or if you have any questions or concerns, both as me as an instructor, as well as me as an infectious disease scholar, I can look up anything that maybe you are unsure about or would like someone maybe with more experience on this topic to do. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. So after that short wellness check, I also would like you to quickly watch this 7-minute short video on applied anthropology at USF. When I say applied anthropology, this is going to contrast what is called anthropology research for just the sake of research, as it is often used as almost a derogative. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it often is when you're talking about applied anthropology, so-called, versus traditional anthropology. But that dichotomy also is starting to, over time, wear away and become a lot more blended together. And that'll make more sense as I go through this presentation and also the one for Wednesday's lecture. Now, when I say applied anthropology, also know that anthropology has been doing so-called applied work, and that basically means I'm not just quote-unquote researching something, I'm actually producing something as well. Since its inception, remember we covered in this class that anthropology started off largely as a colonialist tool to subjugate indigenous communities. For instance, to make it easier for, let's say, Great Britain or Portugal to come in and colonize and extract resources from different countries, let's say in the quote-unquote New World, as an example, and also in Africa. Additionally, applied work today takes many different forms. That being said, so for instance, it could be anthropologists working with public health officials to build community capacity and resilience towards climate change. It could be to find new ways for food banks to outreach local communities so they have better access to nutrition. Or it could be an anthropologist working for Coca-Cola trying to find ways to better market their goods and services to consumers. However, also of note, many anthropologists started around the 1980s to view applied work as lesser than compared to real research. What I mean by this is what's often called the science wars in anthropology, and also the sciences in general. This was not something that was just unique to anthropology, where a lot of scholars that, let's say, were working within the so-called ivory tower of academia saw applied work as somehow inferior to rigorous traditional research. By that, I mean, for instance, anthropologists working with like the World Bank, as an example, were deemed as somehow being unethical or even traitors to the discipline because they were not doing what the academy considered to be anthropological ethical research. So this created a lot of debate on what is science and what is the role of the scientist as well. And some of these discussions still are not completely resolved. And some would say the science wars haven't really ended. We're just kind of at almost like a Cold War where everyone's just trying to make nice with each other, but there's still a lot of tension there. Now, anthropologists largely today have started to recognize that there is merits to doing both. There are times when doing research for the sake of research, let's say producing articles, producing scholarship and textbooks, is very beneficial. It basically improves and builds upon what's already been out there in the sciences, and that is a crucial part of the scientific process. However, other scholars also view and recognize that if anthropologists aren't working in certain environments, let's say in Coca-Cola or at the World Bank, they may be doing things that we might consider to be either culturally inappropriate or unethical. So it might be beneficial to have sort of like an insider-outsider inside of such organizations, but that also implies that this is a necessary evil, and you don't have to view it that way as well. You can, for instance, just be an anthropologist working for Coca-Cola. That is not necessarily a unethical or bad thing. But what ends up happening is in applied anthropologies, you also have to view the ethical standards of your organization and have to compete that or maybe compare that to, let's say, the anthropological code of ethics of the AAA. So, for instance, if your duty is to protect the livelihoods and not do any harm to your participants, what happens when your participants are, let's say, consumers and you're working for Coca-Cola? Coca-Cola may have a very different opinion of what your role is as a researcher. And this can create a lot of tension. But that being said, there always is going to be tension regardless of where you're doing research at and who you're doing research for on that matter. And these issues are not just unique to applied anthropology. They also happen, of course, in so-called traditional anthropology too. So we'll get into these specifics in more detail, but basically just know that anthropology, again, is a very diverse field, and that is only increasing in diversity over time in terms of the kind of work anthropologists consider to be anthropological endeavors as well.
Now, a little bit more context before I get in the so-called debate between applied work and doing what's called research for the sake of research. The Society for Applied Anthropology, or also called the SFAA, was founded in 1941, as discussed by your reading, to, quote, promote the investigation of the principles of human behavior and the application of these principles to contemporary issues or problems, end quote. Now, anthropology has a hard time saying something concisely, which is interesting coming from an applied statement that is trying to make us do more concise work. But essentially what this is saying is that we are trying to understand humans, but not just to understand humans. We're trying to apply what we know as anthropologists to better certain aspects of the human condition. For instance, to improve nutrition, to give increased access for medical resources. This is sort of the contemporary issues or problems that this sentence talks about. Now, the author of your reading, the chapter, also sort of broke down what anthropology is doing today in terms of applied anthropology into two sort of broad topics. First is to produce research that has straightforward findings that can be used to direct interventions or implications that can lead to recommendations for policy change. So for instance, I'm an editor of a journal, an applied anthropology journal, and we often run into this issue where the research we're getting isn't necessarily applied in the sense that we're getting something tangible. They didn't necessarily involve the community actively when they were doing their research. They wrote what we would refer to as implications. This can manifest usually in the conclusion. They would say something around the lines of, it is important that policymakers address this topic in the future. To an applied anthropologist, that is a little insufficient because they're not really saying what they need to do. So we often, for instance, recommend that they expand upon this section and say, okay, what specific policy are you trying to change? What could they be doing better? Just don't point out a problem and say you're doing applied anthropology, because that's not really what the discipline is trying to do. This is somewhat related to the second bullet, which is to test and improve anthropological theory through devising experiments and sociocultural interventions or policy changes. This is sort of a meta way of doing applied anthropology where you're sort of testing the efficacy or the ability for applied anthropology to do the work it's trying to do. So for instance, if an anthropologist is applying, let's take a theory, the political economy of health model, to understand why people are not accessing resources, an anthropologist can go back to the same field site where the research was originally conducted and see if economics really is a concern for the people there, or maybe it's stigma. So for instance, if going back to the food stamps example, it may not be because people lack the resources economically to get food. It could be because they find that using food stamps somehow creates a stigma, or they perceive it creates a stigma, which reduces their ability and their perception towards wanting to utilize food stamps, as an example. To provide a little bit more historical background and context here, anthropologists also served a role in World War II. So during World War II, as the US government attempted to enlist as many resources as possible in their war effort, ranging from women entering the workforce largely for the first time in large masses, to researchers serving some capacity, either military or somehow adjacent to the military. Anthropologists often served as armchair anthropologists, we would call them, essentially anthropologists researching and talking about cultures they haven't been to, largely by doing a review of the literature or finding cultures that are like them and researching them, at least according to their minds. And other times they served as cultural brokers or even spies. Now, a cultural broker is basically a term that anthropologists have sort of given to themselves, which means that I'm an expert in, for instance, US culture. I'm an expert, for instance, in Belizean culture. If we're trying to get Americans and Belizeans to talk with each other, so for instance, to promote diplomacy, an anthropologist could be the broker between these two cultures in order for there to be better negotiations that are culturally relevant and less prone to conflict. Now, there's some criticisms rightly for all of these terms, especially spies, because anthropologists today do not conduct what we would call clandestine research or subversive research on communities. We value, at least nowadays, informing community members that we are doing research and not trying to hide that from them. However, in our history, this has not been the case. Now, a little bit more on armchair anthropologists. A noted one was Ruth Benedict, who I mentioned in this class, I think in the Gender Week a few weeks ago. Now, she wrote a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Patterns of Japanese Culture, to better understand the Japanese, quote-unquote, during World War II, in order for us to better find ways of communicating with them and also understanding why they were invested in the war the way they were. However, this book was widely criticized, even though it is a bestseller, because the methodology, let's just say, was problematic, because she was interviewing Japanese in internment camps in the US when we were rounding up Japanese citizens or second or even third degree, or sorry, generation Japanese immigrants and placing them in camps to watch them for subversive behavior, as was the thought at the time. So Ruth Benedict is interviewing Japanese who may have never actually even been to Japan because they are multi-generations in the US about Japanese culture and making inferences about how the Japanese are or what their culture is, their system of, quote, honor, etc. Now, anthropologists rightly criticize this by saying you're not actually studying Japanese, you're studying Japanese Americans, for instance. However, this book still largely helped inform the military effort concerning, for instance, how the US military should be able to interact with and engage with the Japanese. However, anthropologists also served different capacities in the post-World War II era of development and government restructuring. So for those that aren't history buffs, after World War II, a lot of the members of the UN and other, say, Western bodies played a big role in restructuring the geopolitical landscape in the post-World War II era. So for instance, how we were going to essentially split up Africa, as an example, and who we were going to give resources to. So for instance, the communist bloc, how would we distribute resources? How would the government systems work there? And anthropologists served a role here, largely as, again, cultural brokers or on-the-ground researchers exploring how the community members perceived development work, as well as developing policy that would better serve these communities as well. Anthropologists began to be very critical of our role in World War II for some of the reasons I described in the last slide, including also our development work. So for instance, working with the World Bank. Anthropologists that were critics of these practices were calling us, say us in terms of applied anthropology, handmaidens of colonialism, just as we have been in the past. So in the past, again, going back in the history of anthropology, anthropologists worked with colonial bodies, such as Great Britain, to subjugate the indigenous communities, which lacked a lot of the power that we had as foreign researchers and as more powerful foreign governments. Anthropologists that were taking this stance were saying we're doing this all over again by us working with, for instance, the US or Great Britain again to be able to have a greater influence in Africa or in the Middle East, as an example. In a sense, this is what has been referred to recently as neo-colonialism. We no longer are having boots on the ground. We're not conquering territories physically. We're doing it through policy, economic policy largely. So, for instance, this is called government restructuring, where the World Bank will give governments a large loan, basically saying, we'll give you this amount of money, however, you are going to not tax goods going to you from the US as compensation. So what ends up happening is these governments that get restructuring programs end up having very large debts that they owe the World Bank and the governments that made the contracts with them, while getting little out of it. They get essentially a stipend, which then, like all loans for low-income communities, you can even think of it this way, largely are double-handed or backhanded in the sense that you actually are going to be in the red for some time because of these policies. Now, these critiques are also part of what's called the reflexive turn, which developed into what was known as the science wars. So breaking these two terms down, anthropologists around the 1980s began to question if it was possible to create an, quote, objective study, quote, of culture with our own biases and power relations involved, such as anthropologists working for the World Bank in poor communities again. So basically what this turn is saying is that we are humans. Humans are irrational creatures studying other irrational creatures if you're an anthropologist. So there's going to be some inherent biases because, for instance, if you are an anthropologist from the United States, you have a different conception of the world, of reality, than someone living in, let's say, a remote village somewhere in Africa. So this turn is saying that what we may be seeing, so for instance, if anthropologists at the time are saying these people are being irresponsible by not utilizing their resources effectively, and anthropologists in this sort of mindset may also argue, no, you're using American understandings of being rational to talk about another culture. This is not their reality or their world, and yet that's the language you're using to describe them. This is tied to the science wars, which developed largely out of this turn in the 1990s of scientists in a variety of disciplines debating whether there was even something called reality to study, and whether everything we write is inherently biased in a fiction because humans are not objective and rational creatures. Now, it's called a war because there were roughly two opposing sides. There were those that took a more what's called postmodernist perspective, saying everything that humans write is a fiction. So for instance, if I write an article about Belize and Zika virus, that is not an objective study of the reality of Zika virus in Belize. This is what my perspective on the topic is as a member of the United States, as a foreign researcher, as a man, seeing very different things there than, for instance, if I was a woman. So I may be writing about this is what it's like to have Zika virus in Belize, but that is not necessarily an argument that I can make because of the different intersections I have that have informed my own internal biases. The other side of this, the more hard science perspective, argues that this leads into a downward spiral of never being able to do anything because if everything is a fiction, there's no difference between me writing about Belize as a researcher doing extensive fieldwork than a Belizean and Kikaker writing about Belize and publishing that research. From this perspective, my expertise is invalidated. It doesn't matter that I have a master's degree getting a PhD in anthropology, because if everything is a fiction, everything is essentially worth the same. And that means that science with a capital S is worthless from this perspective. This, of course, is not the case, and a lot of anthropologists now are probably somewhere in between these two perspectives. But it's important to conceptualize this because at the time, a lot of applied anthropologists sort of fell on the more objective side of we need to be doing things. We can't just sit in a room and argue about it. While the researchers doing what's called research for the sake of research, those anthropologists who say you can't be doing this colonial work, you can't be going into communities and saying this is what needs to be done, they largely were the ones that are critical of applied anthropology because they're sitting in their academic context and saying that the work you're doing is problematic, so you shouldn't be doing it. This perspective, honestly, is still sort of pervasive in anthropology, and applied work is seen somehow as lesser or less real science than anthropology that is doing more traditional work of going into the field, doing research, and writing an article about it, essentially. So in response to the reflexive turn in the wake of the science wars, which really didn't have a clear conclusion, applied anthropologists have taken their work in a variety of directions. I'm going to be covering 3, but the chapter focused on public anthropology specifically, so that's what I will begin with. So the definition it provides is that public anthropology focuses on the interface between anthropology as an academic discipline and the broader public that supports and ideally finds much value in it. It emphasizes the role the public plays in supporting anthropology, as well as that anthropology is not an academic island unto itself. That last part about anthropology not being an academic island is trying to get at what's largely the reflexive turn is trying to get. There is no clear line or distinction that separates anthropology from other disciplines. So for instance, I often pull from public health scholarship. That doesn't make me less of an anthropologist, it's just that I'm utilizing literature that doesn't necessarily fall within the silos we've created around anthropology. Additionally, what this is saying is that anthropology as the study of humans necessitates that we engage with them at an active level. So we're not just doing research on birds, we're interacting with humans, and these humans shape our own research. So for instance, if I'm going to Belize, looking at Zika virus, but everyone there is talking about dengue fever, the community has shaped what my research is going to manifest into, because now I'm having to focus on dengue fever, because that's the subject on everyone's mind. If I went there now, it would probably be coronavirus. I'm following a lot of social media in Belize, and as well as government reports, and that's been the talk on everyone's mind, like it has been all over the world. So anthropology interfaces with the public here being the human population, essentially. So we can't just create a border that separates us from those we study. Public anthropology attempts to do this. So for instance, public anthropologists often write news articles that are more crunchable that we can give to community members. Basically boiled down reports that are more easily digestible and less full of academic jargon, with the intent that if we find different ways of communicating to the public, we can have better anthropology as a result and better findings because we've had their input. So input here is also key. So for instance, if a public anthropologist gives the community members a documentary they made while doing their research, community members then can watch it, they can critique it, so they can provide feedback, which can then inform the anthropologist's research. So if I'm doing work on Belize, again using this example, and I'm concerned about Zika virus, but then I ask people there, hey, do you even care about Zika? They may say, not really, we're kind of focused on dengue fever right now because that's more of a concern for us. they then will shape how I conduct research. So public anthropology tries to find ways of engaging the community and making them active participants in the process of doing research. So as discussed on the previous slide, I'm going to engage here with two other forms of applied anthropology, specifically engaged anthropology and activist anthropology. Now, engaged anthropology is somewhat similar to public anthropology, yet more often focuses on changing policy itself. So for instance, writing a policy recommendation report to policymakers. This is often what I do. I consider myself an engaged anthropologist. I can continually keep tacking on more qualifiers to my disciplinary sort of title, but that's the one that I often utilize but don't really say outwardly, because again, I could sit here all day and say critical medical feminist engaged anthropologist. It's just a mouthful, but that's how we talk about these topics. Now, I do this often when I go to Belize. So for instance, when I returned from the field in 2019 during the summer, I wrote a policy recommendation report to alleviate the environmental risk factor burden of mosquito-borne disease transmission. So I did that through pointing out, for instance, areas that are in need of interventions concerning the amount of litter and garbage that is accruing, as well as the distribution of standing water and the lack of access to affordable and free forms of garbage removal services. This report ideally is being utilized by the policymakers in order to craft more effective policy. The critique of engaged anthropology is anthropologists largely lack the power to, for instance, force policymakers to do anything. So for instance, I could give them this report and they could say, thank you, we'll utilize this in the future, and then just throw it in the dumpster essentially. Which is why public anthropology is so important, because it doesn't just get filed in a folder never to be seen again. If you put it out in the public individuals may find that this report is useful to, for instance, negotiate themselves with policymakers to identify areas of concern. So I'm not saying you need to do one or the other. There are benefits to both, and a public document made for dissemination may not be that useful for a policymaker who often is concerned with specific strategies or proposals in order to better serve their community members. Now, activist anthropology sort of does a little bit of both concerning public anthropology and engaged anthropology, but they take, again, a more, as it would imply, active role. So the chapter I had you all read states that activist anthropology is predicated on the idea that we need not choose between first-rate scholarship on the one hand and carefully considered political engagement on the other. Now, this quote is directly engaging with the science wars and the two supposed sides that were fighting each other. So for instance, those researchers doing research for the sake of research, critiquing applied anthropology for not doing good research, they're the first-rate scholarship perspective. From their point of view, you're not doing first-rate scholarship if you're doing applied work, because you're not just doing research for the sake of research, you're doing it with an agenda in mind. However, this is a false dichotomy. Applied anthropologists argue that you can still do good research, and it's not like applied anthropology is doing atheoretical or research that's not utilizing theory. You can do this carefully, not saying it's easy, but you can do it carefully to consider finding ways to do things beyond just writing about what you found in Belize, for instance. How we become activists for the communities we serve. So for instance, if I'm trying to advocate that they change environmental disparities or address them, I'm doing activist work where I'm speaking for, in some senses, or speaking with the communities that I am currently doing research with in order to find more collaborative ways to improve their lives as well as the scholarship that I am producing. So switching gears slightly, I say slightly because a lot of the topics I just mentioned are engaged with in the other reading I assigned you all.
We're going to be talking about community university action research. This is a mouthful, and so are the theories that helped inform this topic, but the venue itself in which they publish is also important to point out. So the journal they published in is called Practicing Anthropology, or PA, and it is a journal of the Society for Applied Anthropology, which I mentioned earlier. Their other journal is Human Organization, which is the academic sort of venue for publishing anthropology articles that are applied, and is what I'm the editor of, or co-editor of, with my advisor, Dr. Romero Daza. Now, practicing anthropology is really interesting is because it attempts to do a public anthropology. I've assigned a few articles from this journal, but as you noticed, it's usually very crunchable in the sense that it's only a few pages long, and they require you, for instance, to also have photos. So it's not just you getting hit with 20 pages of text. Usually these articles are around 5 pages long with photos, short author biographies, and is written in a way that attempts to be able to be translated more easily to community members and wider audiences. So practicing anthropology is essentially a form of public anthropology. However, there are critiques that, again, their writing is still pretty dense for the average person, so whether or not it's an effective tool for doing so is up for debate. However, it is a useful journal in the sense that it allows other anthropologists sort of to see what's being done out there, and gives junior scholars, so for instance, undergraduates or masters attempting to publish something, a means of doing so, because their practicing guidelines are a little less strict than a lot of other more rigorous academic journals. Practicing Anthropology as an applied journal only publishes work that is applied, of course. But again, theory is not divorced from applied research. Theory either explicitly or implicitly informs our work. I say implicitly because some scholars in anthropology or otherwise think they can do a theoretical research, meaning I'm just going to the community to see what's happening here. I'm not doing any sort of theory, I'm just finding out what's happening. However, that's impossible because, again, as biased human beings, we always walk into the field with our biases in some capacity informing what we expect to find in our perspectives of how we interpret the results of our research. So explicitly, this article, for instance, engages with multiple sort of larger paradigmic theories. So again, paradigms are the larger umbrella that theories fall within. For instance, they engage with theories of community organizing, which is largely, honestly, not necessarily an anthropology-specific theory paradigm. Community organizing, as it implies, is usually a lot more grassroots. It's more focused on doing focus groups, for instance, getting community members to talk with each other in the same room as a researcher so we can help investigate or find ways to better identify intervention efforts. Then they have theories of dialogic pedagogy. So pedagogy, I always forget how it's pronounced, basically is just instructing. How are we teaching to students? Dialogic means that there's some interplay, some back and forth. It's not just the instructor, for instance, lecturing in a classroom setting like I'm doing virtually right now. It's a back and forth where the students themselves are taking a more active role. They're talking with the professor. They're providing suggestions or guidelines for instance, how the classroom should be structured, as well as finding ways to work together with the professor to, for instance, craft intervention efforts for community members. Now, theories of action research / community-based participatory research is anthropological, but also public health in its background of origins. Now, action research basically is saying, how do we get people to do things? That's the basic definition of it I can give you. So, for instance, how do we motivate people to find ways to better their community? So for instance, if there's a lot of littering happening in a certain area, how do we motivate or change people's perceptions in order for them to be motivated in order to reduce the amount of litter that is happening in a certain community. Now, related to this is community-based participatory research. For example, a good method of doing so is called photo voice, where researchers give community members cameras and they say, go find an issue in your community that you think is important for us to know. So then they give everyone a camera, the community members go out there and they take photos. And then once all the photos are collected by the researchers can then do analyses to see, is there any pattern here? For instance, if they walked into the area and just said, identify an issue and everyone's taking photos of garbage, the researchers might then say the community members think that litter or garbage is a problem in their community. Each of these perspectives is a good way of forming active research or activist research also, in the sense that you're doing something collaboratively with the community based on their identification of problems in order to better their lives and identify challenges both structurally and policy and socially that are preventing them from fulfilling or feeling that they have quality health and wellness also in terms of health. Now, I'm not going to go through this article entirely because you all ideally did the reading already or will do so. I'll see you in your reflection papers, but there are a few certain sections that I really want to focus on here as they apply to doing fieldwork. Because I'm trying to provide you the tools throughout this semester, and especially in this last few weeks, to be able to be effective researchers, both inside of the classroom or outside of the classroom. So think of this as a toolkit that I am providing you. The readings will, of course, provide other resources you can use and also foundational concepts, which I've been trying to really focus on throughout the semester, definitions that you can latch onto and can help you sort of conceptualize the work you want to do in academia or even in your work afterwards. So I have a quote here from the reading, and that's the educator trainings that CUPI developed and offered through our local public school district were central to our capacity building work. Now, capacity building, I'm sure you've heard as a buzzword, but essentially what it is trying to do is increase the effectiveness of available resources, so cultural, policy, and structural, for instance, to better serve communities. Capacity building is an interesting topic for an anthropologist because in order to build capacity, there has to be, in some sense, existing structure to work with. So one way of doing this that is often sort of employed in public health is to better utilize resources. So if there's a counseling center on campus, but not many people go there because, for instance, they lack the information to know where it is, or there's a stigma around going to the counseling center about what that may mean about your mental health, we may find ways to tweak perspectives or perceptions about these topics and find better ways to utilize them. So right now, because of COVID, the university is trying to push sort of virtual or via phone counseling services in the meantime, as well as other universities too. And this is one way to build capacity because there wasn't really, there was a little bit, but there wasn't a clearly defined way of doing online or virtual counseling. But because of this new developing context, they're developing new ways to reach out to students and provide them resources. So the capacity building at USF concerning COVID-19 is increasing as they try to address this issue. Whether or not they're doing a good job at this is up for debate, and that depends on who you speak with as well, but that's the general concept behind it. So as in this topic, they're trying to increase the capacity of the school system to better serve immigrant families, as an example. They first need to see where everyone is at as a starting point. This leads to theories of action. So theories of action usually have a pre-test and a post-test period, where they're trying to see where everyone is and how we can move them to being more motivated, as an example. So they provide a training survey questionnaire here, which asks them, for instance, I am aware of my preconceptions of undocumented students. Then they would scale this question from I am very prepared or I'm very aware to I am not aware, as an example. And that gives them a better idea of how much effort they need to put in, for instance, moving people from I am unaware to I am aware. So they would conduct this pre-test. So let's say I surveyed you all using this survey in class at the beginning of the semester. And then at the end of the semester, I gave you the same survey. It would be expected that the post-survey would have more people feeling confident or aware or informed than those in the beginning because we've built their capacity concerning these topics. This is a really clear way of doing research. It can be quantified. So for instance, if a lot of people are saying I'm unprepared, you can tabulate that and find, for instance, in the beginning, 80% of people were unprepared, but now in the post-test, 80% of people are now considered prepared or they think they're prepared. So if you're thinking about doing a student research project, theories of action, or sometimes called theories of planned action, are good, easily understood, approachable ways of doing sort of applied research. It was used pretty well here, I thought, in the article, and I thought it was important to highlight that as a way for you to also conceptualize research projects in the future for yourself. So to wrap up this PowerPoint, I'm going to sort of go through a few of their findings, hopefully so you can see the effectiveness of this methodology potentially, and also the whole research structure of them involving multiple stakeholders. And stakeholders are essentially everyone that is necessary or is important in the context of your research. So if you're looking at the stakeholders on a university level, you're looking at undergraduates, graduate students, faculty members, staff instructors, policymakers at the university level concerning also the dean, and also policymakers in, for instance, Tallahassee, who are dictating policies that trickle down to the university. All of these aspects, all of these stakeholders are important when you're looking at, for instance, changing policy on campuses, because each of them plays a role, and that role can largely determine the amount of power you have to negotiate the context of the university. You just heard my cat running across the background, I apologize. So the percentage of teachers who reported that they were aware of their preconceptions of undocumented students nearly doubled after that training. Preconceptions here basically just means biases. So what were their opinions about undocumented students prior to the survey, and were they thinking about them explicitly as opposed to just internalizing them? So for instance, having racialized stereotypes about undocumented students without really articulating what those are. Additionally, 3 times as many, so 17% to 70% of teachers reported they were informed about the institutional, state, and federal policies affecting undocumented students. Meaning, teachers were only about a 17% rate of really understanding the different institutional and structural factors that play into undocumented students trying to get an education in the US. This being at 70% is a good way of seeing that information is a key way of changing perceptions, because information, or a lack thereof, really informs our perspectives towards certain topics. You can think about this right now concerning coronavirus and people not having a clear idea of what they should be doing. So people are running to get toilet paper and all the other, I was going to say nonsense, but I probably shouldn't, that's going on right now. Now, additionally, they discussed that twice as many teachers reported being aware of the effects on mental health that this legal framework causes. Now, this means that less than half of teachers were thinking about how the multiple layers of stigma, of structural factors, can compound and impact the mental health of students, since they now report almost being at 100% rate of understanding the connection between these. It would be thought, and hopefully will manifest into them being more conscious in finding ways to better address mental health concerns on campus for this community. Now, importantly, and to wrap this up, they have a conclusion here, and is that in this current volatile and hostile political climate, this awareness is critical for teachers to confidently support undocumented students effectively. Without the capacity building that this survey, for instance, and also the research in general produced, a lot of different negative consequences, for instance, towards mental health would be prolonged and exacerbated. For instance, if students were not given proper resources and teachers were not properly informed about what role they have in impacting mental health, this problem may get worse, especially in the current political climate concerning immigration, for instance, and especially of late with COVID-19, borders crossing down, and racism towards Chinese individuals, for instance, on the rise as well, and everything else you've been hearing on social media of late. Now, I also want to say, to go on that soapbox for a second, this is also a good example of how you can't separate structure and policy from culture, because each of these subjects informs and reproduces or reifies the others in different ways. If we are not cognizant or thinking about these connections, we may end up doing more harm than good by either not talking about them or talking about them without a lack of information to have a better informed perspective towards these topics.